back to the second episode of Healthy and Whole in Mind, Body, and Soul. My name is Dr. Leonard Presley, and this is my lovely wife,
Johnny Presley.
And we're so glad you chose to join us again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hopefully this episode will also be very informative, very uplifting, and very eye-opening for many of us as we seek to understand some more. So before we go any further, for those that may be new to the program, my name is Dr. Leonard Presley. I'm a physical therapist by trade, or by training, I guess I should say. I have practiced in just about every setting other than pediatrics, so we have an expert here tonight that's going to give us some insights on that. But I'm really looking forward to help to this program as it progresses so that we can get questions asked that people may not have the opportunity to ask, or something that we may not think we need to ask. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll turn it over to you.
My name is Johnny Presley, and I have a master's in public administration. So I've always worked in the public sector with health administration, regulations, all types of things. So between us, we have all types of health type of stuff together. So that's me, Johnny Presley.
All right. And we have with us tonight a guest who has been so gracious and so willing to come on and help us with this topic that I feel is so important. You know, that song that's so popular that some people see as cheesy now that says, I believe the children are our future, but they really are. And, you know, having the information and being armed with the knowledge to understand how we as parents, as adults, as a body of faith, or just community members in general, how we can help to foster that development and growth for the next generation. So, Shauna, you want to introduce our guest?
Well, first, let's introduce this month. This is the month of April. The month of April is the health month for pediatrics and autism awareness. So this show's title, Kids Talk, Development, Support, and Health.
Amen.
So our expert has everything, all the inside information. So without further ado, let us introduce Dr. Smith. And please, Dr. Smith, tell us all about you.
Sure. So I'm Leah Smith. I am a pediatrician in Lexington, South Carolina. I actually grew up in Atlanta and did most of my training at the University of North Carolina. And I've been in practice for about 15 years. And I practice general pediatrics, so that means that I see patients in the office almost primarily, almost exclusively. And then we also round in the nursery and see new babies that are born.
Awesome. That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Smith. And you know what? We're going to jump right into the interview tonight because we want to make sure we make the best use of your time. I don't know if you guys know, but doctors are usually very, very busy.
Yes.
So your time is very valuable. We want to make sure we make the best use of it. So, Dr. Smith, if it's okay with you, Shawnee's going to do the questioning tonight, the interview tonight. I'll jump in if needed.
I hope so. So our first question for tonight is, what are the areas that are assessed or evaluated with kids ages from newborn to teens? And we can slow down when we break each one down. So we can start off with newborns with growth and development or sleep habits, then to toddlers, then to teens or school age kids. So sure. Really on your flow.
So I think what would be helpful for people to know is what they should expect when they're encountering a pediatrician and what's going to happen at those visits when you see a pediatrician. So the first time you're going to see a pediatrician may actually be in the delivery room. Pediatricians come to almost all C-sections and any high-risk vaginal deliveries also, and are in the delivery room to take care of the baby. So you may very well talk to a pediatrician within the first minutes of your child's life. If your child is healthy and goes to the normal newborn nursery, then you will see a pediatrician within 24 hours. So when that pediatrician comes into your room, what they're going to go over with you is whether or not they have any concerns at this point about the newborn, tell you a little bit about the physical exam, make sure feeding's going okay, those types of things. And then once you get home with your new baby, we usually see you within a couple days just to make sure that feeding's going well, weight gain's good, jaundice is not a problem at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Smith, what you said, one of the things I think that I know a lot of folks that I've talked to is that they don't know kind of what is being looked at, even with newborn. When you say things like jaundice and weight gain, are there norms you're comparing them to, or is there, hey, this baby looks healthy for what is particular with that particular child?
Right. So all pediatricians, I'm sure, similar to physical therapists, are trained in a head-to-toe exam to make sure that you don't miss anything, essentially. So our physical exam, some of the main things we look at is we should be looking at the size and whether or not the baby's size is appropriate for the length of pregnancy and the health of the pregnancy. We check a lot of things that people probably don't realize what we're doing. So we check very carefully the eyes of a baby, because there are babies that are born either with glaucoma or other kind of vision problems that you can tell that when you shine the flashlight in their eye the first day they're born. Certainly checking for heart murmurs. And then we do a lot of some musculoskeletal things also that you probably know about. So there are babies that are born with hips that aren't in the correct place or don't have enough support. And so we actually do a hip exam to check for those type of things.
Cool. Wow. Okay. That sounds good. Now, so let's say baby's healthy, you're home, there's no jaundice, there's no, kind of pressing medical issues, and baby's developing normally. When folks bring the child in for a well visit, are there specific things that you look for, and are there certain things that parents should kind of keep an eye out for during that time between visits to kind of give you some information to work with when they come into the office?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is anytime you go see your doctor, either for a sick visit or a checkup, do not be afraid to bring a list of questions. We appreciate that. It shows us that you're taking the time seriously. This is your chance to ask questions and clarify things you might have concerns about. So please bring a list. We're more than happy to see those coming in the door. There are certain things we're looking at every checkup. So growth is one of them, and you ask about norms. Yes, there are charts that we follow, and those of you who have kids have probably seen these charts. So there's growth charts that look at how your child compares to other babies that were born on the same day. And it doesn't matter so much where your child lands. They might be 95th percentile for their weight and 50th for their height. We just care that they stay around the same number so that we know that they're gaining weight, not too fast, not too slow. We also start from the very beginning looking at development. So at each checkup, especially in infants and toddlers, there are certain milestones we expect them to meet. So when it comes to movement, those type of things, babies at 2 to 4 months should be doing better holding their head. When they get to 6 months, they should be starting to sit up, to use their hands to pass things back and forth. When they get to 9 months, they should start crawling. Those type of things we should be looking for, we should be asking about, and you will probably also be asked to fill out some type of questionnaire or survey, because those have been shown to be a little more accurate than just asking a couple questions. Sometimes people, when they have a few minutes to sit and do a survey and think about it a little longer, will put things down that they wouldn't necessarily say if you just ask a yes or no question.
Okay. Cool. Now, I know for me, being a dad and, the dad of boys, I want to be very honest. And for those that don't know, Dr. Smith is the pediatrician for our world. So she's seen all 4 of our little rascals. So, but when Johnny comes home with their list and they're 99 in this or they're 95 in that, I'll be honest, I take a little bit of pride in them being in, the 98th percentile of their height. But I'm really glad you explained that it's not just that they're at a high percentage, but that they stay on that same course, I guess is the best way to say it.
Right, correct. Because certainly if you are short parents, you're not going to have a child who's in the 95th percentile. That doesn't mean there's anything medically wrong with your child. It just means that their genetic potential is going to put them on the lower end of the growth curve. And that's fine. We just want them to gain the right amount of inches, centimeters over time so that we know that they're growing to an appropriate adult height.
Awesome.
So I'm going to just ask a question about newborns, but premature newborns. Like, our boys were born 6 weeks early. And when we brought them into you, you asked us different questions and had concerns because they were born a little early and things like that. Can you tell the people kind of what, because new moms that have that experience, they're nervous and they don't know what to expect. Could you help understand what to expect if they have a child that was born earlier than the time that they should have been born?
Sure. And yes, I actually also had a preemie, so I understand where that's coming from. Everything is just a little bit heightened when you're discharged from the NICU, especially things like the feeding schedule. So when you take a full-term newborn home, we pretty much just say feed them when they seem hungry. If you take a baby home from the NICU, you're more likely to be told they need to eat this amount, this many hours apart, wake them up, don't let them sleep too long. Those kind of things are definitely more intense for their parents of a preemie. There's a couple other things that we follow a little more closely in preemies. So preemies tend to have a little bit more anemia, so that's where your red blood cells are low. That's because the end of the pregnancy is when the mom transfers most red blood cells to babies. And so we follow that a little more closely. We're definitely following development, but with a preemie, development is a little different because they're not expected to necessarily be at the same place. They're given extra time to catch up because they weren't supposed to be born that early.
Right.
And so that kind of stuff we're following a little more closely too.
Now, I heard you talk about, other than height, you look at weight too, and not just weight as if the child is not gaining enough weight, but if they're gaining weight too fast. In newborns, maybe even toddlers, is that something you really need to be concerned about if a child is gaining weight too fast? And if so, what do you do?
And some cultures think that, oh, my child is too skinny, I need to feed him more and more and more.
Right.
And yeah, exactly.
Yes, I would say most cultures like to see a chunky baby. But unfortunately, we're starting to understand more and more that childhood obesity and adult obesity probably really does start in the toddler age period, maybe even in the infant age period.
Oh.
So if your baby is gaining weight too fast, most of what we look at is how much they're being fed and how often they're being fed. So most of the babies that are having problems gaining weight too fast are the ones that aren't sleeping through the night when they should be sleeping through the night. So they're getting 2 or 3 extra feeds in the middle of the night. Or parents are starting cereal or jar food a little too early, and that's extra calories that they really don't need until they get to 4 to 6 months. And then, yes, certainly when they get to be toddlers and they start to be picky eaters, weight and diet becomes huge. Most of us feel like from the ages of about 18 months till 5 is when you have the most control over whether or not your child's going to have a weight problem later in life. So things like avoiding sugar drinks, which is not just juice and soda, but also sweet tea and Gatorade and all kind of things that people don't think about, and making sure they're just not snacking too much and that you're not giving in and feeding them junk at every meal because it's all they eat. So we spend a lot of time between maybe 18 months and 3 years of age talking about how to get your child to eat healthy foods as opposed to just chicken nuggets and hot dogs, because every parent struggles with it and every parent's going to come in with that question. So we're ready to answer those questions and you as much as we can, but we're not passing any judgment because we've all been through with our own kids too.
Right. All right. So I want to ask, how do you get your kids to eat things other than hot dogs and chicken nuggets?
So what studies have shown is that eating as a family is a huge deal. That the more you eat with your kids and the more they see you eating the same foods that you put in front of them, the more likely they'll try it, which kind of makes sense. If somebody puts a plate of something in front of you you've never seen, you're probably going to be a little wary about picking it up and putting it in your mouth. But if your parents, who you trust more than anybody, are sitting there eating it and telling you it's delicious, then you're more likely to try it. And so over time, and by time I mean years and years of sitting with your kids, putting vegetables in front of them, knowing they may or may not eat it, they will eventually come around and start trying stuff, and you'll see more variety in their diet.
Awesome. That is so the old adage about the family dinner table, it has more value than just conversations about school.
Right. And it's huge with conversations about school. Sure. There's a ton of good things that come out of family dinner time, but one of them actually is nutrition.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I want to ask about development because month of April is about autism. How early do you, as pediatricians, start looking at the signs if a child does have autism?
So autism, we really are looking at from the very beginning. It's just that you can't really say for sure that's what's going on until they get a little bit older and you're expecting speech development. So autistic children, one of their primary problems is that they don't socialize the same way other children do. And so from the very beginning, if a child is very social, smiling the minute you walk in the room, trying the whole time you're there to get your attention, laughing when you make faces at them, chances are that child is not going to be autistic. But if I go into a room with a 9-month-old and they're scared of me, they don't really make good eye contact, they're not making faces at me, that means there could be a problem, but it could also just be that they don't really know me and they're not really happy to be at the doctor. So when we really get to the point that we can make referrals and start looking into it more is when they get more to like 1.5 years to 2.5 years. because that's when you can really tell that they're not interacting with other kids their age, their speech is delayed. Those type of things really become more prominent as they get closer to like 2 or 3.
Okay.
So if you see those things as a doctor, could the child outgrow those things?
So definitely children can change. And there are plenty of kids that we are worried about when they're little, and then they do outgrow it. And once they get to school and they've been through therapy, I mean, that's another thing. Like if you put kids into pretty intensive therapy, you could improve their symptoms to the point that they are either far less severe or they actually lose the diagnosis over time. Yeah, so the way we generally work it up or get the evaluation done is through either behavior and developmental pediatricians or through other therapists like speech therapists and physical therapists who could do the whole evaluation, let us know for sure what we're looking at, and get those kids into more intensive therapy so that we can hopefully have a better outcome in the end.
Well, Dr. Smith, I think that's the first time I've ever heard somebody say that a child that has probably been diagnosed or worked up for autism could kind of outgrow it or have that roll off based on the therapies they've had. I don't think most people know that.
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
And most of the time you're looking at it just being a major improvement. If you can take a kid who really doesn't socialize, who really isn't speaking very well, and get them to the point that they can communicate with other kids, then sometimes some of the other differences, the restricted play, meaning they only like certain things, they only want to talk about certain things. If you get to like middle school, high school, you can maybe find some friends that also have the same interests, and that doesn't become as big of a deal.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So we can go into school age kids. Like we have toddlers, school age, and middle school kids. So I would say about my school age kid, right now he's really into this social thing where I have friends. He does look at his weight as well. So the last year, all kids did not play outside like they should have. So weight has become an issue for some kids and socially a little bit awkward. What have you seen since you've been seeing your school age kids as patients or clients?
Yeah, so we have definitely seen a lot of weight gain this year among adults and children. And I think a lot of that is coping. We're all just trying to get through, so no judgment. But a lot of it is also we got out of a lot of the things that we did routinely. We're not playing sports as much as we were. The PE classes become less active, or you weren't in school at all to do PE. So certainly that has become an issue. Also, a lot of kids who've been home maybe don't have as healthy food options as they do at school, or they're not limited at all like they are at school. So at school, you get lunch and maybe a snack. At home, you can graze and eat whatever you want in the pantry all day long. So that has definitely been a problem. And then the social issue has been huge. Lots of kids are having a really hard time keeping up with friends and dealing with the stress because their usual outlet isn't there. A lot of kids also are telling me that even when they're at school, it's just not as interactive as it used to be because they're trying to keep you more physically distanced, which is necessary. I think it's been hard for them even when they go to school to socialize as much as they used to.
So how do you, for kids that are having the social issues, if they're feeling socially isolated, if they're stressed because they don't feel they're building those connections that they need, how do you as a parent support that, or what strategies could you recommend to maybe help parents with this, what is a brand new time for most of us?
Yeah.
Because I know I was socially awkward in middle school and that sort of thing, but it was just, we got to go through it. But now if a kid, if a child felt socially awkward before, or if they were socially doing really well, but now that's been taken away, how do you help them? What are some strategies to help them cope with what could be a very novel and disturbing time for them?
Yes.
Right. So I would suggest that you find some ways that they can keep in touch with their friends or peers at all. And that may mean getting together with a small group of people that's sort of your COVID circle, but at least they can get out of the house and not just be around the same 4 to 6 people all day, every day. Also, there are some activities at this point that we feel are relatively safe. So outdoor sports are definitely safer than indoor sports. There are a lot of churches that are doing a really good job with youth groups, all their meetings outside and, having masks has kept those kind of groups pretty safe. And then the last one, which I hesitate to even say, is that social media has become a lot more useful this year.
Wow.
The ability for kids to play games with their friends and communicate with their friends is just that you got to be watching that as a parent, because you never
Right.
will tell you that they can slip down the rabbit hole pretty fast if you're not paying attention.
Wow. So I don't know if we ever told our boys that they may need to use more social media. I don't think.
So I certainly had not done that until this year at all. But we certainly loosened the reins a little bit. We, kept an eye on it, but we let them do more playing games with their friends and things that we had previously restricted.
So since we just talked about the school age kids, let's go into teens. We were thinking about talking about recognizing high-risk behaviors, mood disorders, starting to act different from what they used to do, and being addicted to substances. As parents, how can we recognize those things? What can we do? Who can we talk to? How should we bring that information to our doctors? Because sometimes some parents are embarrassed to even say those things.
Very true.
Right. So you hit the nail on the head. The main thing you're watching for is if your kid starts acting differently than they used to. Most kids who are having mood problems or substance abuse problems, or they're self-medicating, become more withdrawn, go to their room, don't talk to you anymore, don't want to go out and see their friends anymore. The activities they used to enjoy, they don't want to get up and do anymore. So if you start to worry that that's happening with your child, the first thing I would suggest is that you sit down with your child and have a heart-to-heart in a non-judgmental way to see how much they're willing to tell you. A lot of times if you open up those doors, they'll let the floodgates out and they'll tell you everything. You just have to be open to it and not judgmental and not punishing about it, because they're not going to tell you if they think they're going to get in trouble. And then probably one of the first places to start would be your pediatrician. School counselors are a great resource. A lot of them are trained therapists and have a lot of experience with mood disorders and substance abuse in kids. Pediatricians can go about it a lot of different ways. Most of us are more than willing to talk to parents one-on-one without the child if we need to, and then also probably spend some time talking one-on-one with the child without the parents, so that they know they can trust us, they can tell us things that are important for their health. When you get to be a teenager, from a medical standpoint, you're pretty healthy. You're not probably going to have heart problems and high blood pressure and things like that. The things that will get you in trouble and maybe life-threatening for you are things like substance abuse, getting in a car when you've been drinking, other high-risk behaviors. And so we really delve into that a lot with teens, because we know that's their biggest health risk.
Dr. Smith, I want to ask, you brought up mood disorders. What, when a lot of people hear that term and they may not know, I don't have a lot of insight into what those are and kind of, how you characterize them. What are some of the more common mood disorders that you may see in your patients in your practice?
So probably the most common we're seeing right now is anxiety. We're seeing a whole lot of more anxiety than we used to in kids. Partly because this year, but partly school and sports and everything has just become so high pressured that they're under a tremendous amount of stress. And so we're seeing kids, even young kids, having panic attacks and anxiety to the point that they don't want to go to school or have a hard time functioning once they get to school. So those are some things to watch for. We certainly see depression, but I feel like of the mood disorders, anxiety's probably been the one we've seen a big increase in the last few years. So just make sure that your kids, if you've got them in situations like that they want to be there, that it's really fun, that they're not going to baseball practice 4 days a week because you want them to be there. Make sure they want to be there too, that they're getting their other stuff done and having fun.
And you know what, Dr. Smith, I want to say, and in the community of faith, I'll say this, sometimes we as parents, we really want the best for our children. We want to push them. We want them to make sure they take advantage of every opportunity. But, how would you recognize, just in your strategies, how would you recognize, okay, I'm pushing too hard, or maybe they're not fully interested? Because I know I've heard, people say, kids don't get stressed. They have nothing to be stressed about. They just kind of discount it and rub it off. Well, you don't have bills to pay and blah, blah, blah. How do you recognize those signs of anxiety and that overwork or that pressure and try to deal with it with the little ones, or even as teenagers?
Right. So I think, once again, just keep the lines of communication open as much as you can. And if your child all of a sudden stops wanting to go to baseball practice, talk to them about why, because maybe it's just too much right then, and they need some help getting schoolwork done, or they need to miss one practice without the coach giving them a hard time because they've got to catch up on schoolwork. I think you watch for those type of things, and you just make sure that they're doing it because they want to. So I think it's hard as a parent because we want our kids to be involved in lots of different things. We want them to be doing well at school. We want them to be involved in church. We want them to be involved in sport. We want them to play an instrument. But that isn't going to work for every kid. Mm-hmm. So you have to be understanding and not try to push your kid into what you want for them. Let them be who they're supposed to be. God means for them to be who they will be best as.
Right.
You're right. You're right.
Now, one thing one area that, for toddlers, for newborns, toddlers, school age, and even teenagers, one of the things I think gets overlooked, and I just kind of went back through this. We talked about, them being busy and going to school and practice 4 days a week. How important is sleep, and how much sleep should children be expected to get at these different ages?
Right. So sleep is incredibly important because your brain isn't going to work at school all day long if you're tired, and you're not going to be able to handle the day-to-day stress if you're tired because you'll be irritable being tired. And just in general, structure and schedule is really important to kids and honestly to adults also. So keeping a regular bedtime routine is really important for school performance and just for overall happiness and healthiness. The other part of your question you asked about, how much sleep do kids need at different ages? So most newborns sleep somewhere between 9 and 11 hours a night. Once you get to the 4 to 6 month period where they're sleeping through the night, obviously in the beginning they're not sleeping 9 to 11 hours. And then as kids get older, they get down to the point where as teenagers they probably need 8 or 9 hours. But school age kids are probably still needing 9 or 10, which is not what a lot of kids are getting. So the more the better. And you'll know, some kids don't need as much as other kids. My youngest doesn't need as much sleep as my oldest. So even though they're different ages, they go to bed at the same time because they need to sleep.
Yeah.
Let me ask this question. When it comes to sleep, we talked about social media being important right now for them to stay connected. How important is it to not allow phones and that sort of thing in their bedroom?
Or television.
Or televisions. Is that we shouldn't, there should screen time has to stop at bedtime. Is that a good strategy? Because
it really should stop 30 minutes to an hour before bedtime.
Oh, wow.
So anytime you're on a screen of any type, your brain is stimulated, the images are coming at you quickly, you're captivating your mind, and you need a good 30 minutes to an hour to turn that off and let your mind calm down. So people who say they have to watch TV to go to sleep, it's just a habit. You would probably sleep better and go to sleep faster if you learn to turn the TV off and do something different at that time. But kids certainly, but even adults, if I'm sitting in bed with my phone, flipping through stuff, that's not going to be calming. It makes a lot more sense to read or just, spend time doing something else.
Right.
Family game night, baths, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Good tip.
Okay, so our next question would be, when is it time to call the pediatrics with children? If they have fevers, or if they're vomiting or diarrhea, or if they just have the sniffles.
Right.
Should you call for the newborns that have the sniffles, or should we call for the school age babies that have sniffles? What do you suggest?
So let's start with newborns. Okay. So up until 2 months, a fever is considered an emergency. So a fever for us is anything over 100.4. So if you have an infant and you take their temperature is above 100.4, you call us immediately. And most likely we're going to tell you either to come to the office immediately or go to the emergency room immediately, depending on the time of day. Newborns have not really developed their immune system yet. They haven't had their vaccines yet. And so they are more prone to serious infections like meningitis and pneumonia. And those things need to be checked immediately. And the first time you'll see is a fever. Once you get past about 6 months, when you've gotten the majority of those first vaccines in, fever is not as big of a deal. So if your toddler is in daycare, they're going to have the sniffles 365 days of the year. You've got to base whether or not you go to the doctor on something else. Yeah. So it is very common for toddlers and young kids to have fever even with a minor cold, but it should be low grade. So for us, that's 100.4 to 102.5.
Oh, wow.
100 to 102.5 is considered low grade, and you can give that a few days. So any minor viral illness, you're only going to have 2 or 3 days of fever, and then they should start to get better. If you have a fever over 102.5, we would like to see you the next day in the office. Most of us will tell you, because we hear this all day long, regardless of what number you see, you do not need to rush the emergency room. There's no number that the fever itself is hurting your child. It's just a sign for you that they've got something going on.
Okay.
So don't hesitate to call in the middle of the night before you jump in the car and go to the ER, because we can usually talk you through it, get you into the office the next day instead of you having to go spend 2 hours in the emergency room. And generally, there's not going to be a whole lot they can do anyway in the emergency room with a toddler who has 1 hour of fever. So we recommend that you go ahead and give them some Tylenol or Motrin, because they'll feel a whole lot better. Now, their fever may not go away completely. Tylenol or Motrin will only bring a fever down 2 degrees. If you're starting at 103, they're not going to go back totally to normal, but they'll look like a totally different kid once it's kicked in.
You're right.
In general, yeah, I mean, they look like they're like completely out of it when they've got fevers over 102. I mean, they're like zoned out. But once you get it in them, even if their fever isn't completely gone, they'll perk up and be playful and be smiling again, and you'll see that your kid's back, and you won't feel like you need to rush to the emergency room.
Awesome. That's awesome. Now,
well, that's a little different right now, because right now, if your kid has a fever, we probably need to see them so we can test them for COVID. So it's a little bit of a different year, but most of the time, you can wait a couple days.
Now, at what?
Now I'm interested in that.
Now, I'm interested in that. Now, let me get into that. Let me ask, what is the most accurate way to take a temperature? Because you have the infrared ones, you have the oral ones, you have the one in the ear. You know.
Yeah, most of us are still pretty old school. So most pediatricians are going to tell you not to spend more than $5 on a thermometer. You need to learn how to take it rectally for the first few months of life. You're really not going to hurt your child, we promise. Just barely put it in there, but it's by far the most accurate way to check in an infant. And then once they get older, I mean, even like 6 months and over, you really can check it under the arm, and that's going to give you some idea. Most of us don't care about the exact number. Like if you come in and say, I got 100, and then I checked it again 30 minutes later, it was 100.5, like that doesn't really matter. So check it, see if your kids have got a fever, and then you don't really need to check anymore. You can kind of just base it on how they're acting.
Right.
As they get older, just a regular oral temperature is fine, but most kids can't do that until they're about 8. It's just too hard to keep it under your tongue and keep your mouth closed and breathe correctly. So between about 8 months and 8 years, you're probably best just doing it under the arm. The expensive thermometers are getting better. The ear ones were horrible for a long time because you actually have to, it's supposed to bounce off the eardrum. So you have to be holding it at exactly the right angle for it to be accurate. The newer infrared forehead ones are pretty good. So if you're going to spend some money on a thermometer, I would do the forehead one. But none of us think you need to spend money on a thermometer.
The way the way that they're acting. Can you give us some details of what do you mean acting?
So anyone who's sick, including kids, they're going to be a little less active. They're not going to eat quite as much. They're going to sleep a little bit more, or they might wake up a little bit more, but they should still be playful. So if a kid has a fever and you give them Tylenol or Motrin, and 30 to 45 minutes later, they should be back on the floor playing with some toys, laughing a little bit more. If they're still laying on you and really not active at all, then that's probably when you need to call us and see whether or not you need to go to the ER. Because they really should, even if they still got a little bit of fever, really perk up and start playing a little bit more. And we generally expect kids when they're sick to drink less or eat less, but they shouldn't stop. So a baby who has the sniffles may take 4 ounces out of their usual 6-ounce bottle, but if they're refusing it entirely, that's a totally different ballgame.
Got it. Yeah. Now back to COVID. So I know you said for newborns 100.4, and then for kids above that 100.4 to 102.5. So at this point, any fever now?
Any fever, yeah. So any fever, any runny nose and cough, diarrhea, we're seeing a lot in kids with COVID, and rashes. So we're seeing a lot of kids who have hives that turns out to be the reason that the
Oh,
baby.
wow.
Oh, wow.
So if you see any of that stuff, almost every pediatric office now has easy, rapid tests that we can do to make sure that your kid's still safe to go to school, safe to be around family, those kind of things.
Gotcha. So let's just say a child tests positive. What's the recourse? What's the way forward in that instance?
So there really is not a whole lot to do, similar to any other viral infection. You're doing Tylenol and Motrin and pushing fluids and running a humidifier, that sort of thing. We have seen some good information about vitamins. So a lot of the like vitamin D, vitamin C, those that are supposed to be good for lowering inflammation have been shown to be helpful. So you could always start that. But other than that, there's really not a whole lot to do. The main thing you're watching for is with any viral illness, flu, COVID, just a cold, you should be sick for maybe 3 or 4 days, and then you should start to get better. If after you've gotten better, you get sick again, the cough comes back, the fever comes back, that's usually a sign that you've gotten something worse. So a pneumonia, an ear infection, that type of thing.
Wow.
So we certainly want to see if the symptoms seem to be getting worse instead of better. If they last more than 5 or 7 days, then that's when we need to see you back.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Now, during after the positive test, that first 3 to 4 days, are there symptoms? Of course, you have to let it run its course, like with any viral illness, like you said. But are there symptoms that you would look for to say, okay, things are getting worse pretty quickly here? We need to maybe call them back, even though we know what it is, but seems like something else, or it's accelerating, or it's worse.
Right.
What signs with those?
So the main thing would be shortness of breath. So if the cough is getting worse, they're having coughing spells where they're seeming short of breath, or just like with adults, with kids, you can watch, like if they're struggling to walk up the stairs or they can't run around and play because they're getting winded, then that certainly is a sign that things are getting worse.
Okay. Now, I want to ask this question. Most parents, when they come to the doctor, whether it's a teenager, whether it's a newborn, if the doctor says there's something abnormal or we want to work this up, how do you help the parent in that situation to know that, hey, because a lot of parents can freak out. I'm gonna just be very honest. I mean, I know we've been blessed, to this point, we haven't had any of that, but I know it would really be really concerning. So if something is abnormal or you see something that may be a sign of something abnormal, how do you support the parent in not having them freak out or start
blaming themselves
or looking for all of these alternative cures to stuff? How do you support them in that moment?
Right. So we want you to ask as many questions as you need. And I think most pediatricians and hopefully most doctors are pretty upfront. I'll tell you if it's something I'm not really that worried about, but I think we need to check on it, I'm going to tell you that. If it's something I'm worried about, I'm going to tell you that also, because I want you to know that it's serious and I want you to have time to ask questions about it and not be surprised that something really happens. I think if someone isn't doing that for you, then that's maybe not the best choice for your doctor. But you should 100% ask questions. If you go home and you look it up and something worries you, call back, talk to the nurses, they can get a message to us and we can answer those questions so that you're not losing sleep, because that's the last thing we want is for you to freak out and lose sleep over something that we didn't really think was that big of a deal. We just thought we ought to look into it. But if it's something serious, then hopefully they're going to let you know that.
So what if a person do have a pediatric doctor and they do not feel comfortable with them, how do they go about finding themselves and their children the right doctor?
So I think word of mouth is always going to be the best way to find a doctor. Finding your friends and family are going to have similar values to you and similar things they're looking for. And if you hear that several of them are going to the same doctor and really like them, then that's probably going to be a good choice for you. Most of us understand that not 100% of people are going to be a good match for us, and we're not going to be a good match for them. So most of the time, it's not really going to hurt our feelings if you feel like you need to switch to someone who's a better match. But word of mouth, and just, you're going to get a little bit of a pretty good feeling within the first few appointments, whether or not that person is going to be someone who can answer your questions, is listening to you, all those things that are important. And if they're not, then you need to find someone that is, because taking care of your kids is important.
Hey, yeah, that sounds good. question about I would say teen, school age and teen kids. Now, we talked about earlier, and I'm going to kind of bounce back. This just popped in my head about kids gaining weight too fast. If a kid's not gaining weight, or what you look at, they're not healthy. Their progression with weight is not healthy. How effective are things like supplements, or is it maybe do you start working out for some underlying pathology, or is it just we have to really pay attention to the diet?
Right. So height is really important when you're looking at growth in determining whether or not it's something that's wrong with the kid's diet, or if it's something that's wrong with the kid's hormones and something that's really medically wrong. So if a kid is continuing to grow at a normal rate from a height standpoint, then probably their hormones are fine, their body's doing what it needs to. It's that they're getting too many calories or too few calories. So if they're growing taller just like they're supposed to, but they're not gaining weight, then the main thing we look at to begin with is their calories, what they're eating. So we go through what they ate over the last 24 hours, last 48 hours, and try to make sure they're getting all the nutrients they need and the right amount of calories. If they're not, we generally start with supplementing their calories with things like Pediasure, Carnation Instant Breakfast, those type of things, and then see where we're at. And if they're still not gaining weight, then we start doing more workup about the hormonal things, and genetic causes.
That's great.
Same is also true of weight. So a lot of people worry that when their child starts gaining weight too fast, that it could be their thyroid, because everyone's got some thyroid disease in their family. It's a pretty common problem among adults. But if their height has been fine, then chances are it's not their thyroid. Chances are it's they're eating too many calories, not exercising.
Wow, that's good to know.
We know people that have thyroid, but I've never really asked questions of what is thyroid and how do a person get it and how does it affect the body? I really don't know.
Thyroid's an organ in your neck that controls metabolism primarily. And so it is relatively common in women once they get to adult age to have low thyroid, meaning your body isn't producing enough thyroid hormone to keep your metabolism going. And so you'll tend to gain weight faster, be tireder, you see changes in your skin and your hair, those kind of things. You also can have too much thyroid hormone. So if your thyroid is overstimulated and pushes out too much thyroid hormone, then you start losing weight and you get jittery and you have diarrhea and your body's just in overdrive. And so that's one of the first things we check if we think that there's a medical reason that someone's gaining weight too fast.
Oh, okay. That's great. Now, one thing I want to kind of finish on here is I know with this being Autism Awareness Month, I know we mentioned it earlier, but what is autism? How do you define autism?
So I think the best way to think about autistic children is that they kind of live in their own world and they're not as interested in being part of other people's world, not because of anything they're doing, but their mind just doesn't work that way. So they might not notice anyone else having a conversation in the room because their mind just doesn't see that. They don't notice anybody's there. They might want to tell you over and over and over again about trains because they don't understand that you may not want to talk about trains as much as they want to talk about trains. They tend to have speech delay as one of the major things you see in the very beginning, but that doesn't always stick around. There are plenty of autistic children who talk a lot, tons, but they may not always be on topic. You may ask them a question about how their day went and they tell you about trains because that's what their mind is doing. And so that manifests itself in a lot of different ways because that means you're probably going to have a hard time making friends at school. You have a hard time telling people your needs. So that's, if they can't tell you they're hungry, then they just look grumpy and they look like they're having a meltdown, but really it's just that they need some food and they can't tell you that.
Wow.
And so that is one of the harder and probably sadder things about autism is just that it seems like they're having behavior problems, but they're really just frustrated and don't know how to communicate. And the more you can help them communicate, better they do later on.
So what causes autism? Is it genetically linked? Is it like something that happens during pregnancy and childbirth? Like what causes it?
So we know that it's there when you're born. because they have done brain studies and PET scans and those kind of things where you can tell in infancy a difference in an autistic child's brain and a non-autistic child's brain.
Okay.
So we think it's something that happens before birth. There are also certainly families it runs in. If you have one child with autism, you're far more likely to have a second child with autism. So there must be something genetic. And then certainly there are factors with the pregnancy. If you had pregnancy complications, sometimes that can lead to autism, but it can also lead to other developmental delays and ADHD and those kind of things also.
Okay. Now, one thing I want to ask about is for the parent of, a child that's been diagnosed with autism, what strategies would you give to the parent to support that child? And then how important is it for the parent to have a support network themselves?
Exactly.
Because I know I could see how it could be extremely overwhelming to try to be there and understand what's going on and support that child, but feeling like you're going it alone.
Yeah.
How do you address those two issues?
So I think it's really important that they get involved with the support groups that are available in their community. There's support groups in every community so that they can hash things out with other parents who have autistic children. I'm sure that there's so much that's unknown. Every kid is different. But if you can hear that that's happening in lots of other different kids too, oh, my kid does that also, and talk through strategies and, just support each other, that's huge. The other thing they need is a break. So if you know a family who has autistic children, one of the nicest things you could do for them is to watch their kids and then go to the grocery store by themselves, because you can't just hire a babysitter. Like if I want to go out to dinner with my husband, I just hire the teenager down the street. But if you have an autistic kid, that's not really a possibility anymore. So if you're able to help them in those sorts of ways, it's huge for them.
And I think that's really important. Of course, we are from a body of faith, and I think it's very important to know that, if that person doesn't have any immediate family in the nearby area, but they are a part of a church and they're connected to someone, that could be a great way to support them. It's just by, and that seems so small, but you go to the grocery store by yourself and
well, even church. I mean, it's very hard if you have a child with autism to be able to go to church like you would like to, because you may not be able to leave them in the nursery, but you may not be able to sit in the sanctuary. So helping the people in your church who may have children that are special needs come up with a way that they can participate is also really helpful.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
That's great. Well, Dr. Smith, I think you've answered all of our questions.
Do you have anything else, since you're the expert and the insider? I call you the expert. You've been for almost a decade. That you think that the community at large need to know, should know, or something that can help them when they're looking for the pediatrician or trying to figure out anything about their children at all?
So I'm just trying to think back to things that I see a lot and people have concerns about that I wish I just had a billboard where I could tell people these things. So I'm going to go off on one of those. So let's go. I want to go through what a normal cold looks like and when you should worry. So we kind of touched on this a little bit before, but colds in children, especially the first couple days, they really are just tired and they have a sore throat and then they have a little bit of low grade fever and a little bit of runny nose. Then when you get to the third or fourth day, 100% of the time that runny nose turns nasty and thick and green, and they start getting that junky cough. It does not mean they have a sinus infection. Give it a few more days, because then by day 7, they should be back to normal and you should feel like they're really turning the corner.
Okay.
If they're on day 10 through 14, the runny nose and the junky cough comes back, that's when you need to come see us, because that really often is a sinus infection or an ear infection.
Okay.
So I just feel like a lot of people get frustrated that they come see us on day 3 or 4 of a cold, and we say, it's just viral, there's nothing we can do right now. But I think it would feel a lot better if you knew, day 3 or 4, just let it go. It's going to get better. See how they're doing next week, and then you don't feel like you have to rush in and see us every time.
Right.
And I think maybe the other thing we didn't touch on was when you should go to the emergency room.
Yes.
So, stitches. So the way you can tell if your child needs stitches, this is my rule, is if you could put the end of a Q-tip into the opening of the cut, then it probably needs stitches. So that's just an easy way to remember it. If it's gaping up open enough that you could stick a Q-tip in there, go ahead and go get some stitches. A lot of pediatricians' offices do stitches in the office. Most don't, just because we're really busy and we don't do it that often, and you're not going to be really happy with the result. I haven't done it in 5 years. Well, we do almost all have Dermabond in the office and staplers to do like minor scalp things or like small cuts in the face, that kind of stuff we do. But if it's something that like is big and it's going to need stitches, then go to the emergency room. It certainly, anytime a child has a seizure or major like passes out, head injury, those kind of things need to go to the emergency room. And really, anytime you think your kid needs an X-ray, you certainly can come see us and we can help you decide whether or not they need an X-ray, but we can't do X-rays in our office. So sometimes it's a better use of your time just to go ahead and go to an urgent care that has X-rays. One thing we can do, at least in our community, it's really nice. The orthopedists in our area are very, very nice about getting kids in. And so if you come see us with what you think may be a broken arm, and we agree that we think it's a broken arm, we can usually just call the orthopedist and tell them that, and they'll get you an appointment that day and X-ray it in their office, and it's one stop. So I would always recommend that you call your pediatrician before you make any decision about where to go, because that's what we're there for. We have nurses that return phone calls 24 hours a day. Almost all pediatricians are open on the weekends, so don't feel like you need to rush to the ER or the urgent care. Give us a call and we can let you know if you need to rush to the ER or the urgent care.
What's the difference between urgent care and ER?
So emergency rooms, so emergency rooms are where you need to go if you think your child's going to have to spend the night in the hospital. If you go to an urgent care, they're not in the hospital building. And so if it turns out that it's bad enough that your child needs to spend the night in the hospital, then they're going to have to transfer you via ambulance to the hospital. So you might as well have just gone there to begin with. So urgent cares are really intended more for broken bones, stitches, minor injuries, a fever that when the office is closed. The emergency room is more for heart attacks, strokes, seizures, big things, where you think it's going to take a while to work it up, and maybe even you'll have to spend the night.
Okay. One question I want to ask, and I heard you say this about emergency room, kids fall down, bump their head all the time. How do you know, what should you look for? Okay, the kid bumped their head. Is this an emergency room? Do they have a head injury? How do you kind of triage that to know how that works?
Right. So any loss of consciousness needs to go to the emergency room. But if your child falls down and they're immediately crying and they calm down in a few minutes and they seem like they're back to normal, then they're probably fine. Okay. Children should not seem confused after they hit their head. And people are always like, what do you mean by that? But I think you can tell if your kid's really confused. Like, they don't know where they're at. They don't seem like their normal self. That's your sign that they're confused. And then vomiting. So if you have a major head injury, it can cause you to vomit later. So 30 minutes to an hour later, if that happens, then you probably need to go to the emergency room. And then concussions, we talk about a lot more than we used to, because we're starting to understand how serious they are long term. A concussion is anytime you've got symptoms the next day, several hours after your head injury, then we generally consider it a concussion. So most people with concussions have continued headache. They can be a little dizzy, and they often feel a little confused or a little hazy. Like it's just hard to focus on your schoolwork. Those kind of things are a sign that it's a concussion, and it's important that you see your pediatrician so that we can help you decide when you go back to playing sports and how careful you need to be about avoiding another head injury.
Great. All right, Dr. Smith, thank you so much.
Yes,
this has been
amazing.
This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure there is tons and tons of information that the audience is going to find extremely beneficial. And I just want to say a huge thank you for your time, for your expertise, for all of your insights, and for you making it very approachable. You know, sometimes people, I appreciate that. Sometimes people get put off when they think about the doctor. They don't want to. They think
the white lab coat,
yeah,
scared.
Right.
Most of us pediatricians are pretty nice. At least we like to think so.
I hear you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us. And to our audience out there, thank you again for joining us on Healthy and Whole in Mind, Body, and Soul.
Kids Talk.
Health, development, and support. So we got a little bit of all of that tonight. Yeah. So what we want you to do is get as much from it as you can, share it with those that may need it. And remember, use this information. We're not doing this show just to be on YouTube. We want you to use this information that you can help support the young people and support those parents that may have that special needs child. I think that was a big point that came out tonight. So thank you for joining us again, and we'll see you next time here on Healthy and Whole.
Mind, Body, and Soul.
See you later, Dr. Smith.
Bye. Have a good night.